The scent of simmering marinara and freshly baked bread filled the air, but for Isabella Romano, the warmth of her family's famed restaurant, Romano's Fine Dining, felt colder than ever. She stood before her father, Antonio Romano, behind the grand marble counter where generations of their family had built a culinary empire. But tonight, it wasn't about tradition, it was about betrayal. "You can't be serious, Papa," Isabella said, her voice steady despite the fire burning inside her. Across from her, Antonio leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his face unreadable. "Luca will take over the restaurant," he stated, as if it were an unchangeable fact, a law written in stone. Isabella clenched her fists, her chef's jacket feeling suddenly too tight, as if suffocating her. "Luca?" she repeated, her voice sharp. "He can barely cook a plate of pasta without burning it, and you know it." Antonio let out a slow sigh, his weathered hand smoothing down the front of his crisp white shirt. "This business is not just about cooking, Isabella. It's about legacy, tradition, and the family name." Isabella's heart pounded, her mother's voice in her mind whispering, "Don't push him too hard, Bella." But she couldn't stop herself. "I am the family name," she countered. "I trained at Le Cordon Bleu. I've spent my life perfecting recipes, innovating our menu, building relationships with critics and suppliers. Luca doesn't even want this. He's only here because you handed it to him on a silver platter." Antonio's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing. "He's my son, the firstborn son. This restaurant belongs to him." The word struck Isabella harder than she expected, as if she had always known this was coming, but still hoped she was wrong. She had fought for years to prove herself worthy, rising through the ranks of the most prestigious kitchens in Europe before returning home, believing she could finally step into the role she had earned. But none of it mattered. Not her talent, not her dedication, only the outdated belief that a woman, even one more qualified than her brother, could never run the family empire. Isabella exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "So that's it? All my work, all my sacrifice, for nothing?" Her father's silence was answer enough. She looked at her mother, Rosa Romano, standing by the espresso machine, hands folded in quiet resignation. The same silence she had lived in for years. Isabella turned back to Antonio, her voice now a whisper. "You'll regret this." Antonio picked up a cloth and wiped the counter, as if the conversation was already over. "You're my daughter, Isabella, but this is not your place." The finality of his words settled deep in her bones. She had spent her whole life trying to prove she belonged, but in his eyes, she never truly had. A part of her shattered, but another part, the part that refused to be ignored, blazed with determination. If she wasn't welcome at Romano's, then she would find somewhere that did. Without another word, Isabella turned and walked out of the restaurant, the scent of basil and garlic trailing behind her like a memory of a life she was leaving behind. That night, Isabella stood in her bedroom, the same one she had slept in since childhood, now feeling like a prison. The warm glow of the bedside lamp cast long shadows across the walls where framed photos of her childhood in the kitchen with her father and brother seemed to mock her. A lifetime spent proving myself, and for what? She exhaled sharply, shaking off the sting of rejection as she yanked open her closet and pulled out her suitcase. Clothes, notebooks filled with her original recipes, her chef's knives. Each item she packed felt like shedding a piece of the past. A soft knock at the door made her pause. "Isabella, please?" Her mother's voice came through, barely above a whisper. "Talk to your father again in the morning. He just needs time." Isabella's hands tightened around the handle of the suitcase as she turned to face Rosa Romano, whose tired brown eyes searched hers for some kind of compromise. But there was none to be found. "Time won't change his mind, Mama," Isabella replied, her voice firm but quiet. "You know that as well as I do." Rosa hesitated, wringing her hands as she stepped further into the room. "This is your home, cara mia. Your family. Is leaving really worth it?" Isabella swallowed the lump in her throat. "Of course, it's worth it." But saying it out loud felt like a betrayal, even if the true betrayal had already happened. "I can't stay here and watch Luca destroy everything I love." Her mother sighed, her gaze dropping to the floor. "He's not ready," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "But your father, He believes it is his place. Isabella scoffed, zipping her suitcase with a decisive pull. Because he's a man. The words hung in the air, undeniable and suffocating. Rosa flinched, but didn't argue. Instead, she stepped forward and placed a soft kiss on Isabella's forehead. Just don't shut the door completely, Bella, she murmured before turning to leave. As soon as Rosa disappeared down the hall, Luca strolled in without knocking, dressed in his usual arrogance. His smirk widened when he spotted the packed suitcase. So, you're really leaving? Throwing a tantrum because you didn't get your way? Isabella clenched her fists. This isn't a tantrum, Luca. This is me choosing not to waste another second in a place that will never see my worth. He let out a laugh, leaning against the doorframe. Good luck, Soriolina, he said, mockingly. You'll come crawling back once you realize the world out there doesn't care who you are. She refused to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, she grabbed her suitcase, straightened her spine, and brushed past him without another word. Each step down the grand staircase felt heavier than the last, but she kept moving. By the time she reached the front door, Antonio was standing in the entryway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Isabella wondered if he would stop her, tell her he had changed his mind. But he only gave a curt nod, as if dismissing an employee rather than saying goodbye to his daughter. You'll regret this, he said simply. A rush of defiance surged through her. Isabella squared her shoulders, gripping the suitcase handle tighter. No, Papa, she said, voice unwavering. You will. Then she stepped outside into the crisp San Francisco night, the scent of the ocean breeze mixing with the last traces of garlic and rosemary from the restaurant's kitchen. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The past was behind her, the future was waiting, and she was finally ready to claim it. The rhythmic hum of the city was unlike anything Isabella had ever known. New York wasn't just a place, it was a test, a proving ground, and she was determined to thrive. The day she walked into Aurelia, one of the most prestigious fine dining restaurants in Manhattan, she felt the weight of everything she had left behind pressing against her ribs. But as she tied her apron and stepped onto the line, she reminded herself, this is where I start over. The kitchen was a battlefield, sharp knives, searing flames, and the relentless pace of service pushing every chef to their limit. Unlike at Romano's, where she had to constantly prove herself to her own family, here, no one cared about her last name. They only cared about what she could do. Her first few weeks were brutal. The head chef, Marcus Langley, a Michelin-starred culinary icon, barely spared her a glance. The executive sous chef, Camila Torres, was a perfectionist who had no patience for mistakes. The other chefs, mostly men, saw her as an outsider, another hopeful dreamer who wouldn't last. But Isabella refused to be intimidated. She worked harder, moved faster, and made sure every dish she plated was flawless. When others left for the night, she stayed behind, practicing knife techniques and refining her sauces. She studied the restaurant's menu like scripture, memorizing every ingredient, every cooking method, every plating style. She knew she had to be better, not just good, but exceptional. Her breakthrough came one late evening when Langley noticed her improvising a dish after service, transforming a simple risotto into something extraordinary with an unexpected saffron lime reduction. He tasted it, his sharp blue eyes narrowing as he set down the spoon. Where did you learn this? He asked. Isabella straightened her back. From my family, she answered truthfully, though the words carried a bitter edge. But I learned to make it better on my own. Langley studied her for a moment, then nodded. You've got something, Romano. Let's see if you can keep up. From that moment, everything changed. Langley pushed her harder, testing her creativity, precision, and endurance. She thrived under the challenge. Camila, once dismissive, became an unexpected ally, offering sharp but valuable critiques. Within months, Isabella was trusted with designing her own tasting menu for an exclusive VIP event. It was her first chance to prove that she wasn't just a chef, she was an innovator. Despite her growing success, a part of her couldn't let go of the past. Late at night, she would check reviews of Romano's fine dining, watching as the once revered restaurant struggled under Luca's mismanagement. The menu had stagnated, service had declined, and customer complaints were rising. Even the city's food critics, who once praised Romano's as an institution, had begun turning their attention elsewhere, including to Aurelia, where Isabella was making a name for herself. One evening, as she was finalizing a new dish in the test kitchen, Camila approached her, setting down a newspaper on the counter. The headline read, "Romano's falls from grace. Is this the end of an icon?" Isabella stared at it, her chest tightening. She should have felt satisfaction, even vindication, but instead she felt something else. An ache, a pull. No matter how much she had fought to distance herself, Romano's was still a part of her, and watching it crumble under Luca's incompetence felt like watching a piece of herself disappear. Camilla must have seen something in her expression because she leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Thinking about going back?" she asked. Isabella exhaled, shaking her head. "No," she said, but even to herself it didn't sound convincing. Camilla smirked. "Good, 'cause you've got bigger things ahead." She slid a folder across the counter. "Langley wants you to lead a new project. A restaurant under your name. Investors are interested. This could be your shot." Isabella's breath caught in her throat. A restaurant. Her restaurant. No more proving herself under someone else's name. No more fighting for approval. Just her food, her vision. As she flipped through the proposal, she felt the weight of a decision pressing against her. Romanos was falling, and if she wanted to, she could walk away forever. Or she could do something even bolder, face it head on. The offer sat on Isabella's desk like an open door. She had been waiting for her whole life. A restaurant, her restaurant, the moment she had spent years preparing for. She had envisioned this countless times, a place where her food, her creativity, and her vision would take center stage, free from the limitations of someone else's expectations. But when she saw the proposed location in Los Angeles, her pulse quickened. And directly across the street from Romano's Fine Dining, a calculated move by the investors, no doubt, who knew that the drama of a father-daughter rivalry would draw press and attention. Isabella wasn't sure whether to feel excited or sick. She took the file to Marcus Langley that evening, placing it on his desk. "They want me to compete directly with Romano's," she said, watching his expression carefully. Langley leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "And what do you want?" he asked simply. Isabella hesitated, the weight of the question settling on her shoulders. Did she want revenge? Did she want to prove her father wrong, to watch his empire crumble under Luca's incompetence? Or did she simply want the chance to build something of her own, without Romano's shadow looming over her? She took a breath. "I want to win." That was all Langley needed to hear. Within weeks, Bellissima was set in motion. The investors moved quickly, securing permits, hiring staff, and arranging media coverage. Isabella designed a menu unlike anything Romano's had ever dared to attempt. A fusion of traditional Italian flavors with modern, bold twists, combining the techniques she had mastered in New York with the heart of her family's cuisine. It wasn't about beating Romano's. It was about elevating Italian fine dining to something extraordinary. But as much as Isabella tried to focus on her vision, the media had a different story to tell. Headlines like "Daughter versus Father," "The Battle of Italian Cuisine," and "Bellissima vis Romanos," a family feud served on a plate, flooded food blogs and culinary magazines. Antonio Romano had no choice but to acknowledge the challenge publicly. In an interview, he dismissed her as a talented girl playing at being a chef and claimed that tradition will always win over trends. Isabella read the article twice, her jaw tightening. He still didn't take her seriously. As the grand opening of Bellissima approached, the stakes couldn't be higher. Romano's was already struggling under Luca's leadership, and Antonio knew it. In response, he announced a special legacy menu event, reviving old family recipes to remind customers of Romano's rich history and dominance in Italian fine dining. The message was clear. This was war. The night of Bellissima's opening, the street outside was packed. Food critics, influencers, and even rival chefs had gathered to witness the culinary showdown of the year. Isabella stood in her open kitchen, watching as the first plates left the pass, each dish a statement. Every table in Bellissima was full, and the energy in the air buzzed with excitement. Across the street, Romano's was equally crowded, but there was an undeniable air of desperation. Luca was out of his depth, scrambling to keep the kitchen running smoothly while Antonio greeted guests, his face a mask of forced confidence. As the evening went on, the difference between the two restaurants became painfully obvious. At Bellissima, guests raved about the unexpected but harmonious flavor combinations: handmade truffle gnocchi infused with saffron, woad fiango with a citrus glaze, and the pièce de résistance, a modern interpretation of her grandmother's signature tiramisu, layered with espresso caramel foam and delicate shavings of dark chocolate imported from Modena. The presentation was art, the flavors unforgettable. At Romano's, however, the once revered dishes felt outdated. Customers whispered their disappointments. The same menu for decades, the same techniques, nothing new, nothing daring. By the end of the night, the contrast was clear. Bellissima was a revolution, while Romano's was a relic of the past. But the real moment of victory came when a well-known critic from the New York Times posted her review online that very night. Bellissima is not just a restaurant, it is a declaration. Isabella Romano has taken what her family built and turned it into something greater, something fearless, something unforgettable. Romano's, though once a pioneer, is now standing still, while the world around it moves forward. As Isabella read the words, she felt a strange mix of emotions: pride, relief, and a deep, undeniable sadness. Romano's had been her home once, but she wasn't looking back anymore. The battle between Bellissima and Romano's fine dining had only just begun. What started as a quiet, simmering competition had boiled over into a full-fledged culinary war, with the food world watching every move. The media frenzy fueled the fire, with food critics and bloggers dissecting every aspect of the two restaurants. Bellissima's bold innovation versus Romano's fading legacy. The numbers spoke for themselves. Bellissima had a 3-month wait list within its first few weeks, while Romano's struggled with dwindling reservations. But Antonio Romano was not a man who went down without a fight. In a desperate attempt to reclaim dominance, Antonio launched an aggressive marketing campaign, positioning Romano's as the true home of authentic Italian cuisine. He played on nostalgia, reminding loyal customers that tradition mattered more than trends. He pulled favors with longtime connections in the industry, securing high-profile guests and exclusive interviews, where he publicly dismissed Bellissima as a flashy, short-lived experiment. Meanwhile, Luca, overwhelmed by the pressure, began making reckless decisions. He started offering steep discounts, compromising ingredient quality, and cutting corners in the kitchen, alienating both staff and customers. Despite their efforts, the decline was inevitable. Food critics who once praised Romano's began pointing out its stagnation, comparing its once revolutionary dishes to ghosts of the past. Loyal patrons started drifting toward Bellissima, eager to experience Isabella's fresh take on Italian fine dining. Antonio refused to acknowledge the shift, insisting that his restaurant would outlast her temporary success. But Isabella knew this wasn't just about business. It was personal. One evening, as she finished up service, a waiter hurried into the kitchen. "Chef, there's someone here to see you." Isabella wiped her hands on her apron and stepped into the dining room, where she found her father standing near the bar, dressed in his signature tailored suit. The room quieted slightly, staff and guests alike watching the moment unfold. Antonio's sharp eyes scanned the restaurant, taking in the modern decor, the packed tables, the effortless elegance that Bellissima exuded. When his gaze landed on Isabella, there was something unreadable in his expression. Pride? Resentment? A mix of both? "Papa," she greeted, keeping her voice even. Antonio nodded, glancing at a plate of handmade squid ink ravioli topped with saffron butter being served to a nearby guest. You always did have a way with flavors, he admitted, almost begrudgingly. She crossed her arms, raising an eyebrow. I learned from the best. His jaw tightened, and for a fleeting second, Isabella thought maybe, just maybe, he would say what she had wanted to hear her whole life. But instead, he placed a business card on the table. The Golden Fork Culinary Festival, he said, his voice measured. Romano's has been the reigning champion for 5 years, but this year we'll be competing against Bellissima. A wave of silence rippled through the room. Staff members exchanged glances. The Golden Fork Festival was the biggest event in the industry, a showcase of the best Italian restaurants in the country, with Michelin judges, celebrity chefs, and global press in attendance. Winning wasn't just about prestige, it was about dominance. Isabella looked at the card and smirked. Afraid you can't beat me in your own kitchen, so you need a public stage? Antonio's eyes flashed. I built this empire, Isabella. I won't let you destroy it. She tilted her head. I'm not destroying anything, Papa. I'm just proving I belong in it. The Huos didn't reply. Instead, he turned and walked out of Bellissima, leaving behind a challenge that Isabella had no intention of backing down from. The war wasn't over. It was just getting started. The Golden Fork Culinary Festival was the ultimate battleground, and for the first time in her life, Isabella wasn't fighting for acceptance, she was fighting for victory. The festival was held in a sprawling outdoor venue in Los Angeles, where thousands of guests, celebrity chefs, and Michelin-starred judges gathered to witness the best Italian restaurants in the country compete for the top title. As Isabella stepped into the grand competition tent, she felt the electric buzz of anticipation in the air. Across the arena, she spotted Antonio and Luca standing at Romano's station, their signature deep crimson banner proudly displayed. Her father looked composed, but Luca's nervous fidgeting gave away their underlying tension. This wasn't just about winning a trophy. It was about proving, once and for all, whose vision would define the future of Italian fine dining. Each competing restaurant had to prepare a 5-course tasting menu showcasing technical skill, creativity, and the heart of their culinary philosophy. Isabella had carefully designed her menu to honor tradition while pushing boundaries, a balance she had spent her whole life perfecting. Her dishes included a modern take on classic ossobuco, infused with citrus zest and served with saffron polenta, and a raviolo all'uovo, a delicate pasta filled with ricotta and a perfectly runny egg yolk topped with black truffle shavings. The final dish was her masterpiece, a reinvented tiramisu, deconstructed with espresso foam, mascarpone mousse, and hazelnut praline shards, a tribute to the dessert she had perfected as a child in her father's kitchen. From the moment the competition began, the intensity was unmatched. The heat from the stoves, the rapid-fire orders being shouted, the sharp clatter of knives against cutting boards. Every chef was in their element, creating dishes that would determine their legacy. Isabella worked with unwavering precision, her movements fluid and controlled. At the Romano's station, however, the cracks began to show. Lucas struggled under the pressure, his hands shaking as he oversalted a reduction, forcing him to start over. Antonio's face remained unreadable, but Isabella could see the tension in his posture. He knew they were slipping. As the final plates were presented, the judges moved between stations, carefully tasting each dish, dissecting the flavors, and making notes. When they arrived at Bellissima's table, Isabella stood tall, proud of every element she had crafted. The judges murmured in approval, nodding as they savored each bite. When they reached Romano's, however, their expressions were less enthusiastic. The food was good, of course it was good, but there was nothing new, nothing daring. It was the past on a plate, while Bellissima had served the future. After an agonizing wait, the head judge stepped onto the stage, microphone in hand. The crowd fell silent. This year's Golden Fork Award for Best Italian Fine Dining Experience goes to... The pause stretched for eternity. Bellissima by Chef Isabella Romano. The crowd erupted into cheers, cameras flashed, and Isabella felt her breath hitch. She had done it. She had beaten Romanos not out of revenge, but out of pure, undeniable skill. As she stepped onto the stage to receive the award, she glanced at her father. Antonio stood still, his face impassive, but his eyes said everything. He knew at last that she had earned her place. But Isabella wasn't looking for his approval anymore. This victory was hers and hers alone. The golden fork trophy sat on Isabella's desk, glinting in the soft light of her office at Bellissima. It should have felt like the ultimate victory, the moment she had spent her whole life fighting for, but instead a strange hollowness lingered in her chest. She had proven herself. She had beaten Romano's fine dining in a public arena, gaining the respect of critics, investors, and the culinary world, and yet the victory hadn't brought the closure she thought it would. A few days after the festival, as she was reviewing the restaurant's latest menu revisions, her assistant knocked on the door. "Chef, there's someone here to see you." Isabella already knew who it was before she even looked up. Her father, Antonio Romano, stood in the doorway, looking smaller than she had ever seen him. There was no arrogance, no dismissive glances, no biting remarks, just a man who had spent his whole life believing that tradition was the only way forward, only to realize he had been wrong. "May I sit?" he asked, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. She nodded, folding her hands in her lap as he took the chair across from her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "You were right." Isabella's breath caught, but she stayed silent, letting him continue. "I spent my whole life believing that Romanos would only survive if it stayed the way it always was. That Luca, as my son, would be the only one who could carry on the family name. I was wrong." He looked at her then, really looked at her, the way he never had before. "Romanos is failing. Investors are pulling out. Luca can't handle it. I see that now." His hands tightened into fists before he finally said the words she had waited her entire life to hear. "I need you, Isabella. Romanos needs you." For a moment, she couldn't breathe. It was the validation she had craved for years, the acknowledgement that she had always been worthy, always been more than enough. And yet, as she sat there, staring at the man who had once dismissed her dreams so easily, something inside her shifted. She wasn't that girl anymore. Bellissima was hers. A place built on her own vision, her own talent, her own grit. Walking away from it would mean stepping back into the shadows of someone else's legacy, and she had worked too damn hard to prove that she didn't need Romanos to define her. Isabella took a deep breath, meeting her father's gaze. "I appreciate that, Papa, truly." She offered him a small, bittersweet smile. "But I've already built something greater than Romanos could ever be." Antonio nodded slowly, accepting her decision. There was no anger, no resentment, only understanding. For the first time in her life, Isabella Romano was free. A year after the Golden Fork Festival, Bellissima had reached unparalleled heights. The restaurant had secured its third Michelin star, cementing Isabella Romano's place as one of the most influential chefs in modern Italian cuisine. Reservations stretched 6 months in advance, and food critics hailed Bellissima as the future of fine dining. Investors were now eager to expand, offering Isabella opportunities to open new locations in Paris, Tokyo, and Dubai. She had everything she had ever dreamed of, on her own terms. Meanwhile, Romano's fine dining had faded from the spotlight. Luca had stepped down as head chef, unable to salvage the damage done by years of stagnation. Though Antonio Romano still ran the restaurant, its prestige had diminished, its once loyal clientele shifting toward newer, bolder dining experiences. Isabella had no desire to see Romanos fail, but she knew that its decline had been inevitable. It had refused to evolve while she had embraced change. One evening, as she stood in the private dining room of Bellissima overlooking a full house of satisfied guests, she took a deep breath, savoring the moment. She had done it. She had built something, not out of revenge, not to prove anyone wrong, but because she had believed in herself. As she turned to leave for the night, she glanced at a framed photo on the wall, an old image of her as a child, standing beside her father in Romano's kitchen, her tiny hands covered in flour. She smiled. The past would always be a part of her, but her future? That belonged to her alone. The story of Isabella Romano teaches a powerful lesson about self-worth, perseverance, and breaking free from outdated traditions. Throughout her journey, Isabella learns that seeking validation from others, especially from those unwilling to change, can be a losing battle. Despite her undeniable talent, her father refuses to see her potential simply because of his deep-rooted belief that only a man should lead their family's restaurant. Instead of wasting her energy fighting for his approval, Isabella chooses to forge her own path, proving that success is not given, it is earned through hard work, resilience, and belief in oneself. Another key lesson is that growth requires evolution. While Romanos clung to tradition, Isabella embraced innovation, showing that true success comes from adapting and pushing boundaries rather than staying stuck in the past. Her decision to walk away from her father's last-minute offer reflects an even deeper lesson. Success is not about revenge or proving others wrong. It's about proving yourself right. In the end, Isabella's greatest victory is not just winning awards or surpassing Romano's, it's the freedom to define her own legacy. Her story reminds us that we are not bound by where we come from, but by where we choose to go.